Thank you very much, Dr. Scott Red. It's a pleasure to be here with you at RTSDC. Let me just put this on. I do have handouts for you so that you could follow along with the lecture. A few quotes there for you as well so that we can understand this particular book better. Again, it's a privilege to be here discussing Christian Worldview. This is an important book by Bavinck, and I'm glad to have translated it with James Eglinton and Corey Brock, bring it to the English-speaking world because it is really a significant text. We're going to spend some time this evening just talking about its context, its significance, its arguments. Why did Bavinck like Christian worldview? What was his argument in this particular text? And why is it significant for 21st century readers today? All right? So those are the three things we're going to discuss in this particular evening lecture. So let me just again introduce Herman Bavinck once again, because I think to understand why here at Christian Worldview we need to know something about who he is and what are the motivations behind him writing this particular text. Herman Bavinck, of course, was born in 1854 to 1921 in the Netherlands. He did his PhD at Leiden University, and he was a professor at Kampen Seminary and then at the Free University of Amsterdam with Abraham Kuyper. He was a kind of theological right-hand man to Abraham Kuyper, but I think right now we're starting to recognize that Bavinck was a genius in his own right and not just someone under Kuyper's shadow. He's of course most famous in the English-speaking context here today for his magisterial 4-volume Reformed Dogmatics, where we see not only a great and clear survey of Christian doctrine and the development of historical theology, but also a really great systematic, modern explanation, articulation of Reformed Christian doctrine. What is perhaps less well known about Herman Bavinck was that he was not just a theologian. He was a very concerned public thinker, and he also spent a lot of his time thinking very clearly and very importantly on the relationship between theology and the other academic disciplines. The relationship between theology specifically to other areas of life. He was concerned to articulate why a Christian worldview or a theologically Trinitarian perspective would be very helpful in addressing the problems of modern life, the different fields of study within modern scholarship, and so on. And rightly so. In his own context, behind writing the Christian worldview, there was an 1876 Higher Education Act in the Netherlands that specifically argued, and this is of course not surprising in the modern era, this was coming up, this Higher Education Act specifically argued that theology no longer belonged in the universities. Theology could be taught in the churches, in the seminaries, but a university would teach empirical science. A university would teach religious history. A university would teach religious studies, but not specifically theology, which presupposes that God, of course, reveals himself. In the modern age, that's more and more being doubted, and therefore university studies, a lot of the scholars and public theologians started to say and write and push in public policy, they began to argue that theology shouldn't be in the universities and only be in the seminaries. So Bavinck was very, very motivated, therefore, to write against this particular movement and therefore to show that theology still belonged in the university, that theology should still be taught as a science, as an academic discipline, as a proclamation of public knowledge just as much as the natural sciences, just as much as religious history, just as much as any other academic discipline. Theology belonged in the university. And therefore it was this kind of context that motivated him, therefore, to discover and to tease out the relevance and the power and the significance of the Christian perspective to other areas of life. But interestingly enough, before we even get to the Christian Worldview book, 10 years before here at Christian Worldview, he didn't actually emphasize a Christian worldview. He emphasized instead a Calvinistic worldview. And only as he progressed as a theologian and only as he progressed with the times did he move on from a Calvinistic worldview to a Christian worldview. Now we're at RTS here with a Reformed seminary. I'm not saying that Bavinck became less Reformed as he matured. No. This was a result of particular context and shifts within his own day that allowed him, therefore, and forced him to think more clearly about this and to move from emphasizing a Calvinistic worldview to a Christian one. But it's worth thinking about what he was saying about a Calvinistic worldview 10 years before Christian Worldview was published. This is a quote now that I have for you there in your handouts. 10 years before he wrote Christian Worldview, he wrote an article called The Future of Calvinism. And this is where he really teased out the idea that Calvinism is a whole life system. That Calvinism, in a very Kuyperian fashion, tells you a distinct view of every area of life. Now, this is very interesting. Let me just read now the quote for you. The words Reformed and Calvinistic, Bavinck says there, however, though cognate in meaning, are by no means equivalent, the former being more limited and less comprehensive than the latter. Reformed expresses merely a religious and ecclesiastical distinction. It is a purely theological conception. The term Calvinism is of wider application and denotes a specific type in the political, social, and civil spheres. It stands for the characteristic view of life and the world as a whole, which was born from the powerful mind of the French Reformer. Calvinist is the name of a Reformed Christian insofar as he reveals a specific character and a distinct physiognomy, not merely in his church and theology, but also in social and political life, in science and arts. Notice what he was doing here. It's probably counterintuitive to some of us here today, but he's making a strong distinction between being Reformed and being Calvinistic. He's saying that being Reformed just means a purely ecclesiastical distinction. Being Reformed means to hold on to a particular set of theological doctrines for your church as dogma, but Calvinism is more all-encompassing than that. He is using, of course, Calvin in Geneva here in his Kuyperian imagination. He's suggesting here that if you're a Calvinist, you're not satisfied with merely confessing a doctrine. You're not satisfied with merely confessing a theology. You want to also show that Reformed theology has implications for every area of life, and therefore a distinct theological perspective on social and political life, and in science and in arts. Calvinism was a whole life system. But of course, Bavinck wrote this 10 years before Christian Worldview, and he emphasized the Calvinistic worldview there. Now, why did he therefore shift from a Calvinistic worldview to a Christian worldview? Well, 10 years before he wrote the Christian Worldview, he was still very optimistic about the influence and persuasiveness of Christianity for the Dutch modern culture. He saw that there are other, of course, less than ideal forms of Christianity gaining influence, particularly Roman Catholicism and liberalism. But he thought that no matter what would happen, no matter what kind of oppositions would rise against the Reformed Church, there would still be less than ideal forms of Christianity, but there are still forms of Christianity nonetheless. So Bavinck thought what I needed to do at that point is just to emphasize that Calvinism is the best form, the most holistic form of the Christian perspective, over against Roman Catholicism and liberalism. And yes, theological liberals might say that Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, or that Jesus wasn't fully divine. But theological liberalism would still say that Christianity was a good thing for the world, that Christianity had a good moral influence. And so Bavinck thought I just needed to emphasize Calvinism as the best form of Christianity over other forms of Christianity. But that slowly began to change once we get to the turn to the 20th century. Turn to the 20th century, he saw a more holistic form of unbelief on the rise. He no longer saw his opponents, therefore, merely as Roman Catholics or Lutherans or Anabaptists or theological liberalism. Rather, he saw a more thoroughgoing atheism on the rise, taking hold in the younger and taking hold in the imagination of Dutch culture. And so he started to see, okay, actually, I needed to emphasize Christianity over against unbelief, and not just Calvinism over against other forms of less than ideal Christianity. And the specific figure he has in mind here is, of course, Nietzsche. He thought that Nietzsche presented a thoroughgoing nihilism that needed, therefore, a thoroughgoing Christian worldview in response. So he says this in the very beginning of our text, Christian Worldview. He says here in the 20th century, we no longer need God. There is no place for him in our world. Let the old hermit in the forest continue to worship God, but we, though, the youth of Zarathustra, of course referring to Nietzsche, know that God is dead and will not be resurrected. The convergence of this rejection of Christianity and the inner discord that disturbs us in modern life gives occasion to the question whether the two phenomena exist in a causal relation. Again, what are those two phenomena? rejecting Christianity on the one hand, and this feeling of discord in the modern life. This feeling that there's no unity between you and how you live. No unity between you and the world. No more unity between you and something larger than you and God. There's this innate discord in modern life. And he's saying here, this is because he thinks there's a causal relationship between rejecting Christianity on the one hand and this modern discord. So this is what motivates him to write Christian Worldview. In Christian Worldview, he's going to suggest that Christianity gives distinct answers and gives a distinct reflection on epistemology, how we know things, metaphysics, being, what is truly existing, and finally, ethics. Christianity will give good holistic perspectives on 3 of these areas. So what was Bavinck's argument specifically? If that was why he was motivated to write Christian Worldview, that was his aim, what was Bavinck's argument specifically? I think we now tend to think about Christian worldview as a kind of armchair exercises. There are a lot of criticisms against the Christian worldview as a kind of rationalistic, comfortable exercise of the middle class, some people might say, where you kind of just sit down in your office and you start to just construct a worldview, put pen to paper, and start to discuss what it might look like to be a Christian. But Bavinck, interestingly enough, breaks that stereotype. Bavinck argues that to construct a Christian worldview, yes, you need to see the unity and the holism behind all things, but you have to start actually with sense perception. Look at what he says here in this particular passage before you at the bottom of that first page. Just as sense perception is the basis of all science, the results of science are and remain the starting points of philosophy. Yet it is incorrect that philosophy should be no more than the summary of the results of the various sciences, and that they should be set together only as the wheels of a clock. Wisdom is grounded on science, but is not limited to it. It aims above science and seeks to press through to first principles, and tries to trace the leading ideas in all the different disciplines. Really quickly here, there are 3 important terms, right, that you just saw. There's science, there's philosophy, and then there's wisdom. Science takes a look at the empirical phenomena, the sense-perceptible realities that we encounter in everyday life. So he says that that's where everyone has to start. But if you're going to do philosophy, you're not going to be satisfied with empirical phenomena. You're going to look behind empirical phenomena and start to therefore look at the connecting realities that all of these empirical phenomena reveal to you. And wisdom, therefore, tries to see the unity behind all of the parts, press through to above science to these first principles, these foundational things that undergird all of the empirical phenomena that we see. So when we start with sense perception, in wisdom we follow philosophy to these first principles. And then he says here, once we get to the first principles, we see that there are ideas, uniting ideas behind every discipline. And it does this, therefore, above all, as it seeks for the final ground of all things and builds a worldview thereon. Then it is presupposed that the world rests in thought and that ideas control all things. There is no wisdom other than that which is in and out of the faith in a realm of unseen and eternal things. It is built on the reality of ideas because it is the science of the idea, and because it seeks the idea of the whole in the parts and of the general in the particular. It tacitly proceeds from the Christian faith, which states that the world is grounded in wisdom in its whole and in all its parts. He's saying here, once we get to the first principles behind all of the empirical phenomena that we see, you're going to end up with unseen realities. You're going to start to connect diverse parts into unity, and you're going to start to connect particulars into general wholes. You're going to see, therefore, that once we start with visible realities, you're going to end up with invisible realities, because you're going to see a wisdom behind every single discipline that we study. Now, that's the general method of how to construct a Christian worldview, according to Bavinck. Let me just try to tease out his argument here as he applies it to 2 different areas. First of all, in epistemology, and second of all, in ethics. First of all, in epistemology here, Bavinck is going to try to tease this out and apply to how we know what we know, to the discipline of epistemology. And when he's relating it to epistemology, we have to keep in mind again that he's writing in the 19th century, and he's addressing very particularly 19th century problems, epistemological problems. And the most pervasive question that was wrestled with by epistemologists in the 19th century is how subjects connect with objects, how the ideas in our minds connect with physical reality outside of us. Because ideas are very different than physical reality, isn't it? Consider this chair, for example, this black chair that we have here before us that all of you are sitting on. When you take a look at this chair, a lot of these 19th century epistemologists were thinking, your idea of the chair in your mind and the chair itself are very different things, isn't it? The idea in your mind, well, you can't touch it. You can't feel it. You can't taste it. It's something outside space and time. It's something ephemeral, something that you can't actually tangibly feel, right? But physical objects like chairs, they are tangible. They're out there in space and time. So you have an idea of the chair in your mind, and then there's the chair itself, but the idea is very different than the physical object. So how in the world, and maybe some of you think, well, this just seems like silly talk, but this is a really serious problem in the 19th century. How in the world can mental images, mental representations, truly correspond with physical realities when mental ideas are nothing like physical objects? That was a specific problem. And so a lot of skepticism arose out of this, because ideas have nothing to do with physical objects, right? Now, this was the problem that Bavinck was trying to address here. Two general responses came up out of that to this particular issue. The first response was a non-starter for Bavinck, but it was a serious option in the 19th century, and it continues to be so, I think, today. The first option was a kind of materialism that says, well, we know chairs precisely because you and the chair, you're both actually just reducible to physical objects. Your idea of the chair, it's reducible to just an aggregate of chemical parts in your body telling you that there's a chair, and therefore you're instinctively responding to it. But for Bavinck, materialism can't be a good starting point, because if you reduce ideas to physicality, physicality can't communicate meaning or truth. Physicality can't tell you that what you're getting at is actually meaningful and truthful and reliable. Yes, it might tell you things about how you instinctively react to things outside of you, but physical objects don't communicate reality. There's, on the other hand, in the 19th century, this kind of option, what Bavinck calls dynamism, which basically says you can know chairs because all of you are reducible to immaterial, spiritual things. You and the chair are basically partakers of one pantheistic soup, so to speak. And the reason why you know the chairs is because you both partake in this absolute substance that you can't really feel. There's this unifying pantheistic unity that make you and the chair correspond to one another. And Bavinck just says that just sounds like superstition. That's basically his response to that. But interestingly enough, in his Christian worldview, he basically suggests not that we reject the deliverances of the materialist scientists or of the so-called superstitious dynamists. Instead, he says, what if God has made a diversity of parts into the world? And so we have material objects and immaterial objects, and we shouldn't reduce the one to the other. Of course, we're material objects. We are psychosomatic wholes as human beings, and we relate with the world. And of course, ideas are not reducible to physical objects because everything is related together by divine ideas, but not into this monistic cosmic soup. Rather, everything reveals the plan and wisdom and ideas of God, even within matter. And so Bavinck is therefore suggesting that creation is a diversity of parts. We're made up of bodies, physical objects, yes, but also of ideas and spirits and souls. And we should resist the tendency to reduce one thing to the other. And he's saying here, if you're a Christian, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get a holistic perspective that could take account of the materialist perspective and to get account of the dynamic perspective, the immaterialist perspective. You don't have to choose between a materialism or immaterialism. You can actually get both precisely because the universe is a unity and diversity. It's an organism of diverse parts that are unified together according to the plan of God. Why? Because in God, there's an absolute unity and diversity. God is three and one. There are three persons, but one in essence, in a simple God, and that perfection in God is multiplied in a diversity of parts in all of creation. Profoundly, he was suggesting that if you're a Trinitarian, you can make best sense of both materialism and immaterialism without rejecting the deliverances of either one. Let me now as well move on to the issue of ethics. And I think this one particularly is haunting for those of us now in the 21st century living after 2 world wars. Bavinck is here going to be suggesting in the issue of ethics, he's wrestling with the question in the 19th century, what happens when we rule out transcendent ethical norms and to seek them out in history, as a lot of the German philosophers were doing in that day. Again, if you're a nihilist, if you're starting out with unbelief, you're not going to believe in God, and therefore you're not going to believe that goodness exists outside of you, right? Now, what are the consequences of that belief? And here's Bavinck's suggestion. Bavinck's suggestion is, the moment you get rid of transcendent belief in God, and therefore in the transcendent goodness that exists outside of you, that norms your life, you're going to end up trying to ground that goodness, trying to ground those ideals in something else outside of God, because God doesn't exist. The first starting point that you're going to locate that in, true beauty, true goodness, true value, is therefore no longer in God, but in yourself. But not just in yourself, in a particular people group. Because if God doesn't exist and goodness isn't out there, you're going to try to find goodness as arising out of history, as developing out of history. And he's going to start to say, well, the moment you say that it's developing and arising out of history, you have to answer the question, which history? The Israelite history? The Asian histories? The European histories? And Bavinck is here saying, if you read the German philosophers in 1904, what are they saying about where we can find true ethical goodness? In the German culture, in the German people. God doesn't exist, so we have to find goodness somewhere else. Where can we find goodness? In who we are, in this European nation. So Bavinck observes this particular claim. People are already saying in 1904, the German spirit shall heal the world. But that is how the so-called pure historical view turns out to be the most biased construction of history. If the theory or the system requires it, then the primal human is a wild animal, that the most uncivilized peoples are the representatives of the original human race. Then Jesus did not come from Israel, but from the Aryans. Particularly haunting, isn't it? Bavinck is there suggesting that if you get rid of belief in God and you locate the good in the historical, and that history is your own people group, you're going to end up with a rabid kind of fanatic racism. That is profound. And he was already observing that in 1904, way before the rise of the Nazi regime. Now, he therefore suggests right after this, his conclusion about that particular argument is that relativism appears then to be impartial, as it wants to know of no fixed norms and claims to be concerned with and to speak of only the concrete, the historical, but it makes the relative itself into the absolute, and therefore exchanges true freedom for coercion, real faith for superstition. He's saying there that what the German philosophers of his day are doing is already idolizing themselves as the absolute standard, and therefore adjudicating on the basis of that standard other people groups, and saying, oh, this is less developed. This is not yet the true good and the ideal. We have exemplified what true goodness is. We are the pinnacle of progressive evolution. Again, profound, and it's easy, therefore, to see the relevance of this particular kind of argumentation to the 21st century. What Bavinck is, of course, saying here is that get rid of Christianity and racism ensues. In a perhaps racially tense climate, perhaps in today's day, we do well to retrieve some of Bavinck's instincts here. We need to locate goodness, progress, and truth, not in ourselves, but in the God that is outside of us. And this God, Bavinck is going to argue at the end of this lecture, didn't just remain the transcendent ethical ideal, the logos, but rather he came in history. Yes, goodness and truth and beauty is located in history, but it's not located in our history, but it's located in the history of the incarnate God-man, Jesus Christ. He shows us what is truly good. He shows us what is truly ideal. Transcendence and immanence go together in Christ. So why then, therefore, is Bavinck's Christian worldview exemplary for us today? I hope you've seen already in those brief sweeps of his argumentation in epistemology and in ethics that Bavinck is hauntingly prescient of particular movements even in our own day: skepticism, relativism, and yes, triumphalistic imperialism. But Bavinck's Christian worldview is exemplary for us today because he reminds us of Christian habits of mind that we've probably largely forgotten in the 21st century. Perhaps so. Well, there are three particular things I want to point out about why Bavinck's Christian worldview remains exemplary for 21st century Christians. First, Bavinck's Christian worldview was patiently inductive. In other words, it took seriously, as we saw, the deliverances of the recent cutting-edge research. He was wrestling with the deliverances of the naturalistic scientists. He was wrestling with the skeptics, the philosophers of his day. He was wrestling with even the most superstitious of philosophers of his day, the pantheism that arose in the 19th century. He was wrestling with the German philosophers who tried to suggest that the German culture was the strongest and most developed spirit of his day. In other words, when Bavinck was developing the Christian worldview, he didn't just say, well, we have a Christian worldview and we therefore shouldn't read anything outside of our camp. Bavinck is suggesting that if you have a Christian worldview, you could be confident about it, and therefore, as you're engaging with the most recent cutting-edge research, you're going to start to see how Christianity could actually fill in gaps in particular person's philosophies and could offer a more holistic answer and a resolution to the questions of our day. In other words, therefore, if you want to emulate Bavinck, you're going to resist the temptation to just read Bavinck. You're going to read 21st century cutting-edge research. What are the enduring questions of our day? What is the cutting-edge research of our day today, recently, saying? And how does the Christian perspective address those particular questions of our day? We're not wrestling with pantheism anymore. We're not wrestling with the subject-object dichotomy anymore, not as much anyway, perhaps. But there are enduring questions and new questions that we have to wrestle with in our own day that we have to therefore address as Christians. It was patiently inductive, and therefore be patient. Look at what people are saying and show how the Christian perspective helps what people are saying. And secondly, Bavinck's Christian worldview deepens understanding rather than simplifies. What do I mean by this? Current worldview thinking perhaps simplifies rather than deepens. It reduces complex thinkers into an ism or a worldview in order to denunciate them. What do I mean by this? When we think about worldview thinking specifically, we tend to simplify thinkers rather than deepen our understanding of thinkers, right? We say, well, Kant and Descartes, they're advocates of modernism. So we're not going to read Kant and Descartes, we're just going to say modernism bad, so therefore Kant and Descartes are bad. That's a simplification of Kant and Descartes rather than a deepening of Kant and Descartes. But if you are, as I said before, patiently inductive, we're going to be patiently showing how Christianity could address the particular issues of Descartes and Kant rather than reduce them to a particular ism. Same with maybe Foucault or Derrida. We might say they're just postmodernists. Again, that's a simplification rather than a deepening. Bavinck resists that and almost always brings the Christian worldview at the end of his treatises rather than at the beginning, because he wants to wrestle with issues in each individual deeply and particularly before he shows how the Christian perspective helps them. So therefore, we're not just going to be reducing thinkers to an ism. We're going to trace each thinker to their first principles, show how they need help from the Christian perspective as well. Thirdly, and finally, we might say that Bavinck's Christian worldview was confidently, rather than impatiently, Trinitarian. In other words, he did not begin with a deductive starting point in order to rule out other forms of unbelief immediately, but rather patiently shows their one-sidedness, like materialism and immaterialism, or relativism and absolutism, and shows how the triune God fulfills a more holistic vision. In other words, he didn't immediately argue for the indubitability of Christianity, but rather the inescapability of Christianity. That's, I think, crucial and important. He's going to grant the unbeliever all the room that he needs. And he's going to follow the unbeliever to the arguments and the conclusions of the unbeliever. He's going to be confident about that because he knows no matter where the reasoning goes, no matter where the research goes, Christianity and the triune God are inescapable realities that we will encounter at the end of the day, and we'll have to account for. Thank you.